July 14th, 1940. Sussex, England. Captain Peter Fleming knelt in a forest clearing and watched men dig. They weren't digging trenches. They were digging something far stranger, an underground bunker, hidden beneath trees and brush, invisible from the air, accessible only through a concealed entrance. Inside would be weapons, explosives, and supplies for 30 days. These men weren't regular soldiers. They were farmers, gamekeepers, and shopkeepers, and they'd just been recruited into Britain's most secret military organization, the auxiliary units. Their mission was simple but terrifying. If Germany invaded Britain, they would stay behind enemy lines. They would live in hidden bunkers. They would emerge at night to kill German officers, destroy supply depots, and sabotage enemy operations. They were guerrilla fighters, assassins, saboteurs, and nobody could know they existed, not their families, not their neighbors, not even other British soldiers, because if the invasion came, they had orders to kill collaborators, British citizens who helped the Germans. Auxiliary units would assassinate them without trial or warning. This wasn't regular warfare. This was something darker. Churchill had authorized creation of a secret stay-behind force, a hidden army that would fight after Britain fell. These men would operate without uniforms, without recognition, without mercy. If captured, the Germans would torture and execute them as spies, and the British government would deny they ever existed. After Dunkirk. The story begins with catastrophe. June 4th, 1940. The British Army evacuated from Dunkirk. 338,000 soldiers escaped, but they left behind all their heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, trucks, all abandoned on French beaches. Britain was defenseless. The army was defeated. Invasion seemed certain. Prime Minister Winston Churchill faced a nightmare scenario. German forces were massing across the English Channel. They had complete air superiority. They'd conquered Poland, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and France in just 10 months. Britain would be next. Churchill knew the British Army couldn't stop a full-scale German invasion. The soldiers were exhausted. Equipment was gone. Coastal defenses were minimal. If Germany landed, British forces would collapse within weeks. But Churchill wasn't planning to surrender. He was planning to fight a different kind of war. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Gubbins presented the idea. Gubbins had studied guerrilla warfare. He'd written manuals on irregular combat. He understood how occupied populations could resist. His proposal was radical. Create secret resistance cells throughout Britain. Recruit civilians who knew the local terrain. Train them in sabotage and assassination. Hide them in underground bunkers stocked with weapons and explosives. If Germany invaded, these cells would activate. They'd strike at night. They'd kill German commanders. They'd destroy supply lines. They'd make occupation impossible. Churchill approved the plan immediately. Within 2 weeks, Gubbins began recruiting. The perfect recruits. Gubbins didn't want soldiers. He wanted locals, men who knew every road, every path, every hiding place in their area. Gamekeepers who could move through forests without sound. Farmers who knew every field and barn. Poachers who understood how to evade pursuit. The recruitment was careful and secretive. Officers would approach potential recruits individually, usually at night, always in private. They'd explain the mission, emphasize the danger, stress absolute secrecy. If you join, you can't tell anyone, not your wife, not your children. If Germany invades, you'll stay behind. You'll live underground. You'll fight alone. You probably won't survive. Many declined. The mission was too dangerous, the secrecy too absolute. But thousands accepted. They were motivated by patriotism, by hatred of fascism, by determination to resist. These weren't professional soldiers. They were ordinary men who refused to surrender. The training began immediately. Small groups met at night in remote locations. They learned skills most soldiers never touched. Silent killing with knives, throat cutting, strangulation, explosives, demolition, setting charges on bridges and rail lines, ambush tactics, hit and run attacks, guerrilla warfare. But the most important training was psychological. Instructors explained what would happen if they were captured. The Germans would torture you for information. They'd execute you as spies. Your families might be arrested. They might be shot in retaliation. You won't be treated as soldiers. You won't have prisoner of war protections. You'll die alone in a Gestapo basement, and Britain will deny you ever existed. The men understood. They continued training anyway. The hidden bunkers. Each auxiliary unit patrol built an underground bunker. The bunkers were engineering marvels. hidden so well that German search parties would walk past without seeing them. Construction was done at night. Teams dug into hillsides or beneath forests. They created chambers large enough for 6 to 8 men, reinforced with timber and corrugated metal. Entrances were concealed behind false tree stumps or beneath brush piles. Ventilation pipes were disguised as rabbit holes or drain pipes. Inside, the bunkers held everything needed for guerrilla warfare: weapons, Thompson submachine guns, rifles, pistols, explosives, plastic explosives, grenades, detonators, food, canned goods for 30 days, water, large containers refilled from nearby streams, equipment, radios, maps, compasses, first aid kits. The bunkers were cold, damp, and cramped, but they were invisible. German search teams could pass within feet and never know they were there. The patrols practiced living underground. They'd spend weekends in the bunkers, learning to move silently, to communicate without noise, to survive in darkness. They developed signals and protocols: hand signals for communication, recognition codes to identify friendly forces, escape routes if the bunker was discovered. Everything was planned with obsessive detail, because once the invasion started, there would be no second chances. The target list. The most disturbing part of auxiliary units' mission was the target list. Each patrol received instructions on who to kill. German officers, obviously, Wehrmacht commanders, Gestapo agents, SS officers. But the list didn't stop there. British collaborators, anyone who helped the German occupation, local officials who cooperated with enemy authorities, business owners who supplied German forces, citizens who informed on resistance activities. All were legitimate targets. The orders were explicit. Auxiliary units would assassinate collaborators without trial. No warnings, no interrogations. Just elimination. This wasn't regular warfare. This was something Britain had never done before, planning to kill its own citizens for collaboration before any invasion had occurred. The legal and moral questions were profound. How do you identify a collaborator? Who decides? What if you're wrong? The answer was chilling. Patrol leaders would decide. They'd observe. They'd judge. They'd act. There would be no appeals, no oversight, no accountability, just execution in the night. The men struggled with these orders. They were farmers and shopkeepers, not executioners. But they understood the logic. Collaboration would help Germany consolidate control. Eliminating collaborators would undermine occupation. It was brutal, but so was war. Training for assassination auxiliary units received specialized assassination training. They learned to kill silently and efficiently. The instructors were professional soldiers with combat experience. They taught knife fighting, how to approach from behind, how to cover the mouth while cutting the throat. They taught strangulation, using a garrote wire, pulling tight until resistance stopped. They taught close-range shooting, pistol to the back of the head, quick and final. The training was coldly practical. No romanticism, no heroism, just techniques for killing human beings at close range. The psychological preparation was equally important. Instructors explained that targets would be people the men knew, neighbors, friends, people they'd grown up with. You'll have to kill someone you recognize, someone whose family you know. You can't hesitate. You can't show mercy, because if you hesitate, Britain loses. Germany wins. The men practiced on dummies. They rehearsed scenarios. They hardened themselves. By the time training finished, they were ready. Ready to kill, ready to die, ready to do whatever was necessary. The secret within a secret. Most British citizens didn't know auxiliary units existed, but even within the organization there were layers of secrecy. The deepest layer was called the Special Duties Section. These were intelligence operatives. Their job was to observe and report. They didn't receive weapons or sabotage training. They operated completely separately. Their mission was to watch, to gather intelligence on German forces, to report troop movements and installations. They used hidden radio sets to transmit information to British intelligence. If auxiliary unit patrols were the sword, special duties were the eyes. The two groups never met, never coordinated, never even knew each other existed. This compartmentalization was deliberate. If Germans captured one group, they couldn't reveal the other. Special duties members were even more vulnerable than combat patrols. They had no weapons, no bunkers, no support. Just a radio set hidden in a barn and orders to transmit until captured. Dozens of women joined special duties. They operated radios from farmhouses and cottages. They'd transmit at irregular times, always moving the radio to prevent German direction finding. If caught, they'd be tortured for information about resistance networks. They knew this. They volunteered anyway. The invasion that never came. Summer 1940, Britain waited for invasion. Auxiliary units manned their bunkers. Weapons were loaded. Explosives were prepared. German barges massed across the channel. Luftwaffe bombers pounded British cities. Operation Sea Lion, Germany's invasion plan, was ready, but Hitler hesitated. The Luftwaffe couldn't achieve air superiority. The Royal Navy still controlled the seas. On September 17th, Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. Britain had survived. For now, auxiliary units stood down. They returned to civilian life, but the organization didn't disband. Churchill ordered it maintained. The threat wasn't over. Germany might invade in 1941 or later. The secret army had to remain ready. For 4 more years, auxiliary units trained. New recruits joined. New bunkers were built. The network expanded to 3,500 men, organized into 500 patrols. They covered the entire British coast, from Scotland to Cornwall. Every invasion beach was covered, but the invasion never came. The moral weight. As the war progressed, auxiliary units faced a disturbing question. They'd been trained to assassinate collaborators, but no invasion had occurred. The target lists still existed. Names were still recorded. British citizens marked for execution if Germany invaded. Some were Nazi sympathizers, members of the British Union of Fascists, people who'd praised Hitler before the war. Others were just suspected. Maybe they'd expressed defeatist views. Maybe they'd criticized Churchill. The standards were vague. The judgments were subjective. And the men holding the lists were civilians with no legal training. Several auxiliary units commanders expressed concern. What if the invasion happened after Germany was clearly losing? Would they really assassinate a shopkeeper for selling supplies to a retreating German army? The orders never changed. If invasion came, execute the targets. No exceptions. No hesitation. The men lived with this burden. They knew their neighbors. They knew the names on the lists. And they knew they'd have to kill them if the moment came. The stand down May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The invasion would never come. Auxiliary units received orders to disband. Weapons were collected. Explosives were retrieved. Bunkers were sealed. The secret army dissolved as quietly as it had formed. Members returned to normal life. They became farmers and shopkeepers again. But they couldn't talk about their service. The organization remained classified. Families never learned what their fathers and husbands had prepared to do. Neighbors never knew the man next door had been trained to kill collaborators. The secrecy continued for decades. Official documents were sealed until 1996, 51 years after the war ended. When the files finally opened, historians were shocked. The scale was larger than anyone imagined, the mission darker than expected. Britain had prepared to fight a guerrilla war on its own soil, had planned to execute its own citizens without trial, had created a secret army that existed for 5 years without public knowledge. The veterans speak. In the late 1990s, surviving auxiliary units members began sharing their stories. They were elderly by then, most in their 70s and 80s. They described the training, the bunkers, the weapons, and they described the psychological burden. One veteran said he'd spent 50 years wondering if he could have done it. Could he really have killed his neighbor for collaborating with Germans? He never found out. The invasion never came, but the question haunted him, the uncertainty, the moral weight. Another described the secrecy. He couldn't tell his wife what he was doing. She thought he was in the Home Guard, a defensive militia. She never knew he was training to assassinate people. When he finally told her in the 1990s, she was horrified. "You would have killed people we knew?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "if I had to." The marriages that survived the revelation were strained. The truth was too dark. These weren't soldiers who'd killed enemy combatants. They were men who'd prepared to execute civilians. Even though they never did it, the preparation itself was disturbing. The hidden bunkers. Some auxiliary units' bunkers were never found. After the war, many were simply abandoned, sealed and forgotten. Decades later, hikers and construction workers occasionally stumbled upon them. They'd find underground chambers filled with rusted weapons, corroded ammunition, rotted food supplies, silent monuments to a war that almost happened. Each discovery revealed the scope of the operation, the sophistication of the preparations. These weren't amateur efforts. They were professionally engineered installations. In 2008, metal detector enthusiasts found a bunker in Kent. Inside were Thompson submachine guns still packed in grease, plastic explosives that had remained stable for 63 years, maps marked with German target locations. The bunker had been sealed in 1945 and never opened. It was a time capsule of Britain's darkest contingency plan. The legacy auxiliary units represent something unusual in military history, a resistance army created before occupation, a guerrilla force organized by the government. Most resistance movements form spontaneously after invasion. Auxiliary units was pre-planned and officially sanctioned. This raises profound questions about resistance, collaboration, and legitimate warfare. If Britain had been invaded, would auxiliary units have been heroes or terrorists? They'd have worn no uniforms. They'd have struck from hiding. They'd have killed without warning. Under international law, they'd have been illegal combatants. The Germans could have executed them as spies, but from Britain's perspective, they'd have been freedom fighters. The moral ambiguity is uncomfortable. It challenges clean narratives about World War II. We think of British resistance as heroic. We praise the French resistance and Polish underground. But those movements formed after occupation. They fought against existing enemy control. Auxiliary units prepared to fight before invasion. They planned to kill before anyone collaborated. They created target lists based on speculation about who might cooperate with Germany. That's a different moral category. Preemptive execution of suspected future collaborators. No trial, no proof, just suspicion and elimination. The unanswered questions. The full truth about auxiliary units remains unclear. Many documents were destroyed before declassification. Target lists were burned. Names were erased. We don't know who was marked for execution. We don't know how many names were on the lists. We don't know if any assassinations actually occurred during false invasion scares. Some researchers believe auxiliary units conducted operations that remain classified. There are gaps in the historical record, unexplained incidents, mysterious deaths. One historian investigated the deaths of several British fascist sympathizers in 1940 and 1941. They died in accidents, traffic crashes, falls, apparent suicides. Nothing provable, just suspicious timing. Were these auxiliary units operations, practice runs, preemptive strikes against potential collaborators? We'll probably never know. The evidence is gone. The witnesses are dead. All that remains are questions and shadows. The final word. Britain's secret underground army existed for 5 years. 3,500 men trained to fight after Britain fell. They built hundreds of hidden bunkers. They practiced assassination and sabotage. They prepared to kill their neighbors if those neighbors helped Germany. And then the invasion never came. The bunkers were sealed. The weapons were collected. The organization disbanded. Most members lived the rest of their lives in silence. They'd been prepared to do terrible things for a noble cause. They'd been willing to sacrifice their humanity to defend their country, but they never had to make that choice. History gave them a gift. They trained for darkness but never entered it. They were willing. They were ready, but they never had to act. That's the story of Britain's secret underground army. The resistance that never resisted. The assassins who never killed. The dark contingency that remained hidden for 50 years, a secret kept even from themselves.